Dal Vangelo secondo Marco, la parola con I segni che la accompagnavano.
Very moving to experience all this, and there was a lot of feelings involved in it, and it was very sad, but it did very beautiful.
The Vatican says the Pope died of a stroke and had irreversible heart failure. Francis had been hospitalized earlier this year for a respiratory crisis that developed into double pneumonia. The Pope making that final public appearance before a packed crowd in St. Peter's Square yesterday, Easter Sunday. Well, Megan Williams is at the Vatican, and tell us what the reaction to the news has been like at the Vatican in Rome today.
Well, Ian, I mean, for me, it started in Rome. When I got the news, a colleague called me to let me know. And of course, I knew that this would mean jumping in a taxi and getting down to the Vatican as soon as I could. But when I left my apartment complex, there were neighbors out, and I said, "Have you heard the Pope has died?" And they all said, "Oh, mi dispiace." I'm really sorry. And even the cab driver, she said the same thing. She said, this Pope was one of us. The Pope was, of course, the head of the Catholic Church, but he was also the Bishop of Rome. And I think in particular, Pope Francis really conveyed, was able to speak in a language that Romans felt that he was one of theirs. I mean, he was from South America. He had Italian roots, of course, but he had a certain irony. He had a certain sense of humor. He used to say at the end of his Sunday blessings, buona domenica e buon pranzo, have a nice Sunday and have a good meal. So there was a real closeness that this Pope brought to it. And of course, the language that he spoke internationally as well, as we hear all of these responses from popes all over the world.
So there's the power of his personality, which I think he charmed a lot of people. There was also his view on policy. And so tell us more about how his legacy will be remembered by the Church.
Well, I think he really transformed the Catholic Church as much as he could, obviously. This was a pope, as we know, he wasn't interested in some of the cultural wars his predecessors engaged in. He was a pope who, of course, believed in Catholic doctrine, but he wanted to bring about changes. And he was savvy enough politically to understand to not engage in wars over rewriting doctrine, but just to shift the church. And he shifted it away from the Vatican, away from Europe, by appointing many cardinals from really small places in the world, some of them larger, but he didn't do what most popes did, which was promote archbishops in power cities. He did a bit of that, but he also brought in Africa and Asia to the church, which is where the growth of the church is. So we're left with a more global church, and we're also left with a decentralized church that allows local parishes, priests to decide on important issues to them, whether it's blessing same-sex marriages or something else in a different culture that's important to a local community.
I see in the notes it says that you met him twice. I didn't know that, so let's finish with this. What were the circumstances, and what impression did he make on you?
Well, I met him as part of a group of journalists. I was able to shake his hand. He shakes thousands and he shook thousands and thousands of hands. But the highlight for me was being on the papal plane when he made that visit, the penitential visit to Canada to apologize to Indigenous peoples over the residential school system. I was able to chat with him a little bit on the plane and convey to him just what an important historical moment this was for Canada and for First Nations and Indigenous peoples. He nodded, he smiled. He would often, I overheard with other colleagues, make little jokes. He transmitted a warmth and he was a listener. I think that even in those short exchanges, that's what I took away from him. He was somebody who was used to listening. which isn't always the case with people who come up in the Catholic Church and are taught to preach. He was a preacher, a pastor, but a listener.
You're so fortunate to have that contact with him. Megan, thank you very much for speaking with us. Let's bring in our next guest. David Perlich is the CBC's Vatican analyst, and he joins us from Calgary. And so, David, first of all, tell us how Pope Francis was different than his predecessors.
The Catholic Church always maintains that there's a great continuity between popes, and certainly there is, but each pope brings his own personality. So if Pope John Paul II loomed large on the global stage, and Benedict was a more reserved pope, Francis is sort of the pope who laughs, the kind pope, the parish priest pope. So you could see in his formal speeches, he would read them out, but then he'd put his papers down, and then he would bring this kind of warmth and these sort of like folksy tales that you'd expect more from a parish priest than a pope. And in that way, he really resonated with people, I think, in the church. That made him different. But he was also a very political pope and a very dynamic pope.
Different in life and I guess in death as well. How will we see that reflected in the coming days?
He's asked for his funeral to be simplified. So the funeral for Pope John Paul II, which I was at, was very grand and ornate. And in this case, the Pope has made revisions to the funeral mass for a Pope to try to bring it down more into a more humble sort of aspect. It's still going to be very, very grand, obviously, but he's trying to simplify it. And that, too, is a message, even in his passing.
How relevant is the Catholic Church, do you think, in today's society?
You know, that's such a good question. Most of the things that we think of as politics are actually about morality. What is justice? What does it mean to be included? What is mercy? What's kindness? What do I owe to other people? So in that sense, everything that the church talks about is actually kind of the stuff that fuels politics. But popes also have a huge diplomatic corps. They become involved in peace negotiations. They sit as a permanent observer at the United Nations. So the relevancy, whether or not you believe in the faith, I know people who are profoundly atheist, but actually were intrigued by some of the words around GLBTQ inclusion that Pope Francis said. So I think in a sense, in a world that seems to have recently kind of spun out of control and gone mad, a pope can serve the function of a moral bulwark, sort of an anchor to the conversation, or in Francis's case, a spark to those conversations. And as we've seen, rulers, leaders from around the world commented on him today, and that means that they're paying attention to what he has to say.
Yeah, and to think his last, or one of his last major meetings was with the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance. I don't know if we'll ever get like an accurate reading of what happened in that meeting, but it sure would be interesting. Francis is described by many people as progressive, as a supporter of social justice. And David, when I hear those kinds of adjectives, I wonder, is that, kind of progressive relative to his predecessors, or progressive in the modern world, just period? What's your sense of that?
That's such a difficult question to answer, to be honest. What is religion other than social justice and the search for social justice, whether you agree with people's answers or not? Certainly within the church, this Francis's legacy will be this concept of synodality, which is listening, of gathering members of the church and members of people from outside the church and listening, talking, discussing issues. So in a very real sense, that has rocked the church, and his detractors, they hold it against him for fuzzying up. Francis argued, and his supporters argued, that he never actually did affect doctrine. He might have sort of worked around some of the tradition, but he was actually trying to breathe new life into some of the processes of the church. And of course, for traditionalists, that was very difficult. But by elevating these conversations, of refugees, LGBTQ people, Indigenous rights. It depends whether you consider that a social justice movement or part of your faith or part of a political discussion.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting answer. We have just a minute left. Is there any way of telling what direction the next pope will go in, what direction the church will go in now?
Francis has appointed the vast majority of the cardinals who will go into the Sistine Chapel to elect his successor. I think the question will be, will they want someone who continues to drive his particular vision forward? Will they want a more tempered version of it? Or is it possible that enough people would say this was too disruptive? I think it is quite possible that we'll see a slightly moderated version of the Francis legacy continue. Some of the names that are mentioned would fall in line with that. But it's always so difficult to know. Certainly the world's geopolitical situation and the conflicts we are having, war and tension and domestic conflict, tariffs, borders, that will play into the kind of conversations the Cardinals having. And they will certainly want somebody who can deal with a world that has become as complicated as ours has.
It's really nice hearing your analysis, David. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.
David Perlich, CBC's Vatican analyst, and he's in Calgary.